Welcome to Stepping Stones. I'm Pastor Dave Michael. I'm so glad that you can join us this morning for this YouTube message. The good news is I'm very excited that for the first time today, June 28, 2020, we're having in-person services. We're having an outdoor service, but I know that some of you are not able to attend or don't feel safe to attend. And so we've decided to also put the message online for you to watch as well. So I'm glad you've joined us. I'm continuing my Amazing Stories message series. This is a summer tradition for me. I really love the Bible, and I love the Bible stories. And so each summer I pick a handful, 4 to 6 of them, and share the great message of the Bible. The Bible is so filled with truth about who God is and how he works with humanity. And so I'm just really glad to do this series. It's one of my favorite of the years. Now, some of the stories I'm going to share are going to be very familiar. You're going to be like, oh, yeah, I know that story. And some might be ones you don't know or only know a little bit. But even if you know them, they're going to be, I think, a great reminder and refresher of God's truth. So today, I'm sharing the story of Jacob and Laban. Now, Jacob is the grandson of Abraham, and Abraham is sort of where it really all started. God created humanity, and people kind of went and did their own thing, and finally God said, I'm picking someone. And so he picked Abraham, and he said, Abraham, I'm going to be your God, and you and all your descendants are going to be my people, and I'm just going to stick with you, and I'm making this deal, or he called it a covenant. And so Abraham had a son, Isaac, and Isaac had a son, Jacob, and Jacob was part of this tradition. God was with him. And you may even have heard read in the Bible where it says the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he's one of the patriarchs, the ones who was there in the beginning. And so Jacob in his life is, he inherited this God from his grandfather and father, and it took him a while to kind of figure out who is this God is real. He looks out for me, and slowly give him his whole heart. And so we're seeing Jacob in his younger years, and Laban, the other person in this story, is Jacob's uncle. He's his mother's brother, Laban. And so, and we're going to find out soon to be his father-in-law. And so the story is really about these in-laws that sadly live almost as though they're outlaws. We're going to see some conflict and struggle, and some of you know what it's like to have family strife and divisions and complications in your extended family, and so you're going to relate well to this. And I think it's an encouraging story in that God knows sometimes the struggles we have in our families. And so today I want to share the story. I'm titling it Dysfunctional Family. It's the story of Jacob and Laban. And we can all relate to family problems. I grew up in my family, and as the older I got, I learned more and more about there was some dysfunction. There was some bad things in our past. I learned that my one grandfather was an alcoholic, and his wife, my grandmother, really struggled with that and at times attempted suicide. That was kind of that's sort of, they didn't share that openly, it just sort of came out over the years. And then my other side of the family, my mother's side of the family, has a lot of issues. There's a lot of mental illness. There was even some homicidal tendencies that thankfully never came to fruition. But there was some other stuff that I just can't even share with you. There was some real scandal and some real problems. And so it makes me look back on the family I grew up in, my mom and dad and my sister and I, the four of us. We had I got to say, looking back, our life was pretty boring. We were pretty traditional. We didn't have a lot of problems. There was some passive-aggressive behavior, some yelling and some arguments, but for the most part, my family was spared a lot of this. But in my extended family, it got a little bit trickier. So the story of Jacob and Laban is filled with trickery, selfishness, anger, control, deception, stealing. And to me, it's interesting and almost ironic that Jacob's story where he meets Laban, his uncle, soon to be father-in-law, and the dysfunctional family stuff that comes out of it comes right on the heels of some dysfunctional family stuff that Jacob was already in the middle of before he got there. Jacob has a twin brother named Esau, and Jacob had tricked and stolen his brother Esau's birthright, his inheritance, and ultimately even his blessing from his father. And afterwards, things were not very good. And the family, I think, was even concerned that his brother Esau might turn to violence. And so his mother advised him and said, "You need to move away." And he said, "No, it's time for you to get a wife anyway, so go visit my brother, your uncle Laban. And this way you'll be away from Esau, and at the same time you can get a wife from his people, because that would be really good." And so Jacob sets out. He's going to kill two birds with one stone. He's going to get a wife, and he's also going to avoid any further conflict with Esau. And so he arrives. He finds Laban. He's welcomed by his extended family. His uncle's so glad he's there. He invites him, "Live with me, work with me." And after about a month of this, Uncle Laban decides he likes Jacob. He likes having him around, and he wants to sort of formalize this arrangement. And Laban is primarily focused on the economic side, the work, the how are we going to make money, get feed ourselves. That's his side of it. But we're going to see Jacob's focus is more on relationship. He's more focused on, I came here to get a wife. So let's take a look. I'm going to begin sharing the story from Genesis 29, verse 14, reading from 14 to 20. It says, "After Jacob had stayed with Laban for about a month, Laban said to him, 'You shouldn't work for me without pay, just because we are relatives. Tell me how much your wages should be.'" Now, I got to pause right there and just say, this sounds like a really good start of it. The nephew comes, he's welcomed into the family, he works, and then the uncle seems like he's concerned about Jacob's well-being. You shouldn't work for free. I should pay you. And I think Laban quickly discovered Jacob was a great worker. God was blessing him, and he wanted to make it clear what was Jacob's and what was Laban's. And so Laban's got some ulterior motives here, but it starts out sounding really wonderful, like, "I'm looking out for you, kid." Continue with verse 16. It says, "Now Laban had two daughters. The older daughter was named Leah, and the younger one was Rachel. There was no sparkle in Leah's eyes, but Rachel had a beautiful figure and a lovely face. Since Jacob was in love with Rachel, he told her father, 'I'll work for you for 7 years if you agree to give me Rachel, your younger daughter, as my wife.' 'Agreed,' Laban replied. 'I'd rather give her to you than to anyone else. Stay and work with me.' So Jacob worked 7 years to pay for Rachel, but his love for her was so strong that it seemed to him but a few days." So this seems like a great deal, and probably this is the height of the story as far as family niceness before we get to the dysfunction. Everything's going good. They got a deal made out. Everyone's happy. He found a wife. Laban likes him. It's all good. And he's going to work 7 years, and it's going good. Now, I got to stop right there and just note that verse 20, in my opinion, is probably one of the most romantic, love-filled verses in the whole Bible. Every time I read it, it just puts a smile on my face. And it says, so Jacob worked 7 years to pay for Rachel, but his love for her was so strong that it seemed to him but a few days. And I love that. I mean, Jacob loved Rachel. This wasn't just infatuation. If it had been after a month or maybe 6 months or a year, he would have been tired of this. But he wasn't. He worked for 7 years. He was working to get a wife, a woman that he loved. And so very awesome. Now, this part of the story might seem a little bit almost crude or like a transaction, almost like Jacob is buying a wife. And the rules of marriage throughout history and different cultures are quite varied. And some of them seem strange to us. And it might seem odd that he would have to buy his wife from his father-in-law, and that a man would almost sell his daughter off in marriage. But bear in mind, there's some customs much different from ours. What I want to focus on is that verse 20, and the fact that this is truly a love story. And Jacob loves Rachel, and they just want to start this family together. He truly loves her. He's found the perfect wife. And he loves her so much, he's willing to basically become a servant to Laban. Work for him for 7 years. All I want is a wife, and I'll be happy. So now, again, I say that's probably the height of the great part of the story because it takes a turn. Unfortunately, the family love and trust and all the warm fuzzies is kind of short-lived. The tradition for Laban and his people is that the older daughter must get married first. I don't know why that was their tradition. Probably, in this case, we're told that, Leah didn't have a sparkle in her eyes. Some translations say she had weak eyes. I think it just meant she wasn't as pretty as her sister. And so it was important that she not be shamed or that she not be an old maid. So Laban's like, we got to marry off Leah first. So Laban makes the deal. You can marry my daughter Rachel. It's a done deal. But then he decides to trick Jacob into marrying his older daughter Leah instead. And and I think Laban also sees an opportunity to be greedy here, because if he can get 7 years for marrying Rachel and he tricks Jacob into marrying Leah, he's going to get another 7. But so what happens is on the wedding day, Laban substitutes Leah for Rachel. Now, I don't know what their customs were. Maybe, she was heavily veiled, or maybe, they went into their wedding night room and it was dark. But whatever their customs, it was such that Laban was able to pull the switch. And Leah married Jacob instead. But he didn't figure it out until the next morning. And so picking up in Genesis 29 or chapter 29, verses 25 to 27, verse 25. But when Jacob woke up in the morning, it was Leah. What have you done to me? Jacob raged at Laban. I've worked 7 years for Rachel. Why have you tricked me? It's not our custom here to marry off a younger daughter ahead of the firstborn, Laban replied. But wait until the bridal week is over. Then I'll give you Rachel too, provided you promise to work another 7 years for me. Wow. So the first point in this story of a dysfunctional family. Number one, Laban sabotages the marriage of Jacob and Rachel. This is pure sabotage. Jacob loves Rachel. He doesn't want to marry Leah. But and you wonder, is Laban doing this because of the custom, the traditions, or does he see an opportunity to get more work out of Jacob, to basically trick him? Either way, it's a bad deal. And so he works 7 years, thinks he's getting Rachel. He gets her sister. He's furious. And Laban just kind of passes off. Don't worry about it. You can have them both as wives. And so he has a week with just Leah. And I imagine at this point, Jacob and Rachel are fuming, and probably Leah too. And then 1 week later, he takes a second wife, the one he wanted in the first place, and has to work another 7 years to work it off. Now, when Laban hatches his scan, he knows that Jacob's going to agree, because he can see the love he has for Rachel. And he got Leah, and there's no denying it, and it's like, you're going to have to work again to get the other one. And so what I find very interesting is, because of the turmoil that this brings, the conflict, the jealousy among sisters, later on in history, when Moses was giving the law he received from God, one of the laws was, don't marry sisters. And I believe it's very much tied to this event, because it did not work out well. I'll read the verse. It's from Leviticus 18:18. While your wife is living, do not marry her sister and have sexual relations with her, for they would be rivals. And rivals they were. This was before the law, and they were such rivals. And I like I say, I really believe that the whole Rachel, Leah, Jacob thing inspired this law. But there was just the whole family dynamics were ruined. Laban really sabotaged Jacob's marriage. He wanted one woman. He wanted Rachel. That he loved her, and instead he had an unloved wife, Leah, but he was still his wife. And he had Rachel, who he loved, but the sisters were constantly in competition. They were jealous. They were angry. One of the ways they competed was who could have more kids. And so it became a kid-bearing battle. It was just awful. And the rivalry lasted until Rachel died. She died in childbirth, giving birth to her second son, Benjamin. And honestly, the rivalry lasted even beyond that, because we see even in the children, some were favored over others, and the rivalry just continues, and it just created a major dysfunction within the family. A lifetime of rivalry and dysfunction. So, after another 7 years, 14 years total, Jacob has both of his wives paid for, and he's ready to leave. He's going to take his wife, he's going to take his kids, and he's ready to move back to his homeland. He only went up here to kind of get away from Esau for a while, his brother, and to get a wife. He's done all that. He's ready to return home. But Laban offers him another deal. And if you read this, like parallel with the first account, when he said, after he'd been there a month, this deal sounds so similar. Or I should say, Laban sounds so much similar. He makes it sound like, hey, I don't want you to work for nothing. Let's strike up a deal. And so this is from Genesis 30, verses 27 through 31. Please listen to me, Laban replied. I have become wealthy, for the Lord has blessed me because of you. Tell me how much I owe you. Whatever it is, I'll pay it. Jacob replied, you know how hard I've worked for you, and how your flocks and herds have grown under my care. You had little indeed before I came, but your wealth has increased enormously. The Lord has blessed you through everything I've done. But now, what about me? When can I start providing for my own family? What wages do you want? Laban asked again. So Laban knows what's going on here. Since Jacob's come here, he's become a wealthy man. Whatever Jacob touched just seems to prosper. And this is because, Jacob is Abraham's grandson, and God made a deal with Abraham, a covenant. I'm going to be your God. I'm looking after you. And so Jacob is tending the flocks. Everything's getting better. The animals are healthy. They're breeding well. And Jacob, knows that it's because of God. Laban knows it's because of God, but Laban wants to make a deal. He's scammed his son-in-law out of 14 years of labor, and now he's trying to extend the time. And so point number 2, first was that Laban sabotaged the marriage of Jacob and Rachel. Point number 2, Laban cheats Jacob out of the flocks of sheep and goats. The main part of their wealth was the flocks. They were shepherds. They moved them around so they could graze. They bred them. They used them for their own food, probably for the wool for clothing and so forth. And the extras they used to trade. This was how they got their money, their wealth. This was their business. And so Jacob, he said, he decides, okay, I can name my wages. He says, I want all the sheep and goats that are speckled or spotted. And I also want all the black sheep. So I'm thinking the majority of the sheep and goats were white or some other color. And so Jacob's like, I'll take the speckled ones, the spotted ones, and the black sheep. Those are the ones I want, which is probably a portion of all of the flocks. And so Laban agrees. He quickly agrees. He says, you can, that'll be a great deal. But then Laban is such a cheater. He takes all the spotted and speckled animals and the black sheep, and he moves them far away and has his sons watch them where Jacob can't see them. He basically steals them. I'm going to read here from Genesis 30, verses 34 to 36. All right, Laban replied, it will be as you say. But that very day, Laban went out and removed the male goats that were streaked and spotted, all the female goats that were speckled and spotted and had white patches, and all the black sheep. He placed them in the care of his own sons, who took them a 3 days' journey from where Jacob was. Meanwhile, Jacob stayed and cared for the rest of Laban's flock. So this family dysfunction is going beyond. It's becoming like a criminal. He's stealing. He's agreeing to things and not doing it. Oh, wait, that's sort of what he did with the marriage thing. What Laban, though, doesn't seem to realize is that God has made this deal, this covenant, with Jacob's grandfather, and it's for all of his descendants. So this covenant that is for Abraham is also for Isaac and Jacob and his descendants all the way down through time. And so even though Laban is trying to cheat Jacob, he can't mess up God's plan. And God blesses Jacob anyway. And so Jacob comes up with this plan that when he's breeding, he's found a way that he breeds the strongest females and the strongest males, and they always seem to end up speckled. And I don't quite understand. There's something about how he has them watch certain strips of bark, and that makes it happen. All I know is the Lord's blessing it. But I want to read this account from Genesis 30, verses 41 to 43. It says, whenever the stronger females were ready to mate, Jacob would place the peeled branches in the watering troughs in front of them. Then they would mate in front of the branches. But he didn't do this with the weaker ones. So the weaker lambs belonged to Laban, and the stronger ones were Jacob's. As a result, Jacob became very wealthy, with large flocks of sheep and goats, female and sheep and male servants, and many camels and donkeys. So God leads Jacob to breed these animals in such a way that when they see these bark, it makes the resultant animals spotted speckles. Basically, God's saying, Laban can try and cheat you, but I'm going to give you more of the lambs that will be yours. I'm going to bless you and take care of you. And so Jacob gets the stronger animals. He gets more births. And so Laban, you would think, would be thinking, this is my son-in-law. He's married to both my daughters. I want this to go well. But instead he cheats them. He's cheating his own family. First he cheats both Rachel and Leah into marrying the same man, which was awful. He cheats Jacob to get 14 years out of him. And then he cheats him by stealing the animals and trying to manipulate it so he doesn't even give Jacob what he agreed to. But none of this could undo God's blessing for Jacob because of the covenant God made. So, point number 3, God's blessing on Jacob could not be stopped. That's great news. Many of you have experienced some harsh family things or just harsh things in general in life. And it's good to know when God takes care of his people. The New Testament tells us that when we by faith accept Jesus as saviors, we're basically, by faith, Abraham's descendants. So we're included in this deal too, just like Jacob was. And nothing can stop God's blessing on his people. And so if you were to read this whole story, which, a hint, that's one of the next steps. It's only 3 chapters. Great story. If you put the whole thing together, it really looks like Laban is going to stop at nothing to just keep Jacob working for him, to cheat him, to get wealthy from him. And he doesn't ever want him to leave. It's basically, he's been there 20 years. He came up to find a wife, and 20 years later, Jacob has basically had enough of his uncle, father-in-law Laban. What should have been a place for family love and support, a great time when they helped each other. I mean, Jacob, if they'd have become wealthy, Jacob would have more than likely said, I can't take all this. You started it, and I took your daughter. Let's share this. But Laban went greedy. But finally, after 20 years, God calls Jacob home. He says, it's time for you to go back to your homeland and back where you belong. And so Jacob knows Laban pretty well. He waits until Laban's kind of far away. He's out on a trip, doing something with the flocks, not nearby. And at that point, Jacob takes his wives, his children, all the wealth he's accumulated, and he heads back. He's ready to head back to his homeland. He wants to be out from underneath Laban's thumb. And it's just so sad. It's always sad to me. Families are better when we support one another. We all benefit. There doesn't need to be the kind of stuff we see in Laban. And so, but I want you to know, in spite of what your life has been like, in spite of what trouble might have been in your family, God promises to always bless his people. And now, even though Laban was able to cause an awful lot of trouble, and he was, he sabotaged his marriage. He tried to steal from him. In spite of all that, God took care of him. And so Jacob barely escapes from his father-in-law. Laban, of course, figures out that he's gone, and he comes after him. He doesn't want to lose his number one worker who makes him money. And there's this confrontation. And this is Genesis 31, verses 40 through 42. And Jacob is speaking here in this confrontation. He says, I worked for you through the scorching heat of the day and through cold and sleepless nights. Yes, for 20 years I slaved in your house. I worked for 14 years earning your 2 daughters, and then 6 more for your flock. And you changed my wages 10 times. In fact, if the God of my father had not been on my side, the God of Abraham and the fearsome God of Isaac, you would have sent me away empty-handed. And so he's smart enough to figure out what's going on with Laban. But thankfully, in spite of it, God has blessed Jacob. But as with all of life, it's never without its problems. And so the final point, this might be what kind of brings it all together, point 4. Jacob's life has its share of suffering, even though God was blessing him. And that's a hard lesson. Even when God blesses us, life can be very hard. It was by God's, just the fact that Jacob was even able to get away was by God's grace and intervention and his blessing. Laban came after, and I think he was ready to fight and bring violence. But God warned him in a dream as he was, before he left or on his way, leave Jacob alone. And Laban knew what God could do. He'd seen the blessing on Jacob. He knew not to mess with him. And so, in spite of all this, God still takes care of him. But the bottom line is the story of Jacob and Laban is such a sad story. A family filled with greed and deception and lying and cheating. Instead of helping one another and supporting one another, being better together, there was selfishness and dysfunction. And so this might be making you think of some situations in your family. I hope not, but if it does, realize that even when God blesses us as his people, there is suffering in life. There was suffering for Jacob, and there's suffering for us. But the hope that we have, we know God is always with us. He's watching out for us. He's looking over us, and he brings us through our trials and troubles. As sad as this story is from the family standpoint, it's also a story of hope and security. God watches out for his people. And so the Bible is filled with all sorts of promises that God is going to be with us. He doesn't get us out of all of our troubles. We all know we face life with the good and the bad. And Jacob's story especially shows this, and especially the whole sister wives thing. It just saddens me to think, that verse 20, probably the most romantic verse in the Bible. He worked 7 years. It just seemed like a few days. And then it ended up married to 2 rival sisters. It's just so sad how life can turn out. And you've probably had your share of disappointment and heartache and things in life that have just almost defeated you. We have to remember that God is still there looking out for us. He doesn't change everything to make it smooth in life, but he's there with us through it. We know we can trust God. He will provide what we need in the time we need, even though it doesn't seem like it at times. He will bring comfort and healing from our pain and our sorrows. And so I thought I would end with some promises of God. I'm going to share something from the Old Testament to show you this is how God has always been. And we know the promises are in the New Testament. Some of us are probably more familiar with Jesus' promises. I'm going to be with you. I'll always be with you even to the end of time. But this is from Deuteronomy 31:8, and it just is a great reminder of how God looks after his people. It says, "Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord will personally go ahead of you. He will be with you. He will neither fail you nor abandon you." And I'm very thankful that in spite of all the heartache and pain and struggles and trouble, even sometimes by close family or friends in life, I know that God is on my side, that God is for me. And his love for me, the security I have in God, outweighs all the troubles of this life. I guess it's maybe a lesson. I'm almost thinking of a new. I'm going to next steps now. I'm almost thinking of I'm going to add one, and that is, you know, experience life with joy. We have enough hardship in life that when things go well, that when God blesses us, be filled with joy and happiness and celebrate. So that's the new next step number 1. Just added that. Next step number 2. This is a little, kind of the hard side of this. Accept my lot in life. Be at peace with the trouble in my past and the trouble in my future. This is basically saying, this is the life God has given me. It's had some trouble in the past, and I know there's going to be trouble in the future. I'm going to accept it. I know we face sorrows, but let's seek to not let bitterness grow. Let's seek to forgive others. I'm going to take it as it comes, and I'm going to accept it. I'm going to love people, and I'm not going to let it make me grow angry and bitter. And then along with that, the next step, number 3, that I'm challenging you with today, trust in God's goodness. Trust in God's goodness. Put your faith in God for your future, for your happiness and joy. Know that God will take care of you. God's grace and peace will not only see you through, but they'll bring healing and love and joy through it all. And then the final next step, number 4, read the story today. It's in Genesis 29, 30, and 31. I've hit you some highlights today, but there's so much more to it. And so I pray that you will consider and take a next step today. It's so important that we move forward in our faith, that we grow. And we do that by, when God hits us with his truth, we become aware of it. We say, I'm going to respond and say yes to God. So I want to pray for you as you consider and take those next steps, and pray that the Lord will bless you. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this wonderful story of Jacob and Laban. There's some highlights, and then there's some low points. And through it all, Lord, you are there watching out for Jacob, blessing him as one of your people. And I pray, Lord, today that you would watch out for and bless your people, those that are listening to this message today, that we would be reminded of what a great God you are, that we can always put our trust in you. Help us to grow in our faith. We want to take next steps that will help us to love you more, to serve you more, to live our best life as you lead us. And we just pray in Jesus' name that you would help us. Amen. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'm glad you were able to check out this amazing story online. Before you go, or as you go, I would ask you to go to our website, steppingstoneschurch.net, and fill out an online Connect card. I'd love to know you watched the video. Also, what your next steps are. I'm always encouraged as you grow in your faith. If you have any prayer requests, you can share them on the online Connect card as well, and our prayer team will pray. And I pray the Lord bless you. God bless. Have an awesome week.